On the morning of December 16th, 2000, Jerry Mike Williams goes skunk hunting before going on a weekend getaway with his wife Denise for their anniversary. However, that morning when Mike goes hunting, he doesn't return home. A search begins for Mike in hopes of finding him alive. This disappearance would be the beginning of a mystery that would leave a case unsolved for 17 years. Welcome to the Campfire. Grab your s'mores and grab a seat. Thanks for joining me tonight around the campfire, where we discuss the dark world of true crime. I am your host, Kevin. This is the Campfire Crime Chronicles, a true crime podcast. And this is the case of Jerry Mike Williams. Before we get into the case tonight, I want to thank the show's sponsor, BetterHelp, for helping keep the flame lit of the campfire for this episode. BetterHelp is the world's largest therapy service that's 100% online. So you don't have that awkwardness of sitting in a waiting room with a whole bunch of other strangers waiting to see your therapist. With BetterHelp, you have access to a network of over 25,000 licensed and experienced therapists who can help you with whatever you're dealing with. All you have to do to get started is answer some questions about what your needs and preferences are in therapy. So that way, BetterHelp can match you with a therapist that is right for you. And if you want to change your therapist because maybe you're not comfortable with them, you can change your therapist at any time for no additional charge. You also don't have to wait any specific time or any number of sessions to change your therapist. So when you match up with that right therapist, you can talk to your therapist however is most comfortable for you, whether it's text, chat, phone, or video. You can also message your therapist at any time and schedule live sessions when it's convenient for you and your schedule. With BetterHelp, you get the same professionalism and quality you expect from in-office therapy, but with a therapist who is custom-picked for you with more scheduling flexibility and more affordable prices. So if you go to the website and use the show's code, betterhelp.com/CCC, not only does that let them know that you heard it at the campfire, but you'll also receive 10% off your first month. So that's betterhelp.com/CCC. BetterHelp, HELP.com/CCC. All right, guys. So thank you for joining me tonight for episode 13, lucky number 13. So as we get into the case, we always start with the background. So Jerry Mike Williams, he went by Mike, was born October 16th, 1969. He grew up in Bradfordville, Florida, which is north of Tallahassee. His father was a Greyhound bus driver, and his mother, Cheryl, was a home daycare provider. The family lived in a double-wide trailer where Mike and his older brother, Nick, grew up in. Instead of building or buying a house, his parents saved their money so that both kids could go to North Florida Christian High School. The family wasn't wealthy by any means, but they were middle class and they lived comfortably. The boys would work nights at a local supermarket to also help fund for their schooling. Growing up, Mike was described by his mother to always be in a hurry. He got into sports playing football in high school and was also the student council president, as well as being active in the Key Club. Anything Mike had, he worked for, and nothing was handed to him. The Key Club is a high school organization that is student-ran and helps students in leadership skills. At the age of 15, Mike also picked up duck hunting as a hobby that he would continue on doing in his adulthood. Mike was a good-hearted, kind person as described by his childhood friend Denise Brogdon. Denise met Mike when she was 10 years old, and in 9th grade, he tells Denise about meeting this girl, Denise Merrill. Denise wouldn't be the only person that he would meet in 9th grade. He would also meet his best friend, Brian Winchester. So Denise and Mike would begin dating and would eventually become high school sweethearts, marrying on December 17th of 1994. Now remember this date because it does become a factor later on in the episode. Mike would go on to attend college at Florida State University, or FSU, and graduate with a major in political science and urban city planning. Prior to graduating, he would be hired by Clay Ketchum of Ketchum Appraisal Group as a property appraiser. Mike was always dedicated, hardworking employee and was always looking out for his family and wanted the best for people. It was known that after his wife Denise would go to bed, he would return to the office and continue working later into the night. He would also work on the weekends after going duck hunting in the mornings. Around this time, Mike was making approximately $200,000 annually, and him and Denise would buy a house in an upscale subdivision on the other side of Tallahassee. On May 8, 1999, Mike and Denise's daughter would be born. It was said that Mike was a devoted father, and on December 14, 2000, just a couple of days before Mike's disappearance, Mike and Denise would tell both Mike's mother and his brother Nick that they were going to plan on having another kid sometime in the near future. They would also tell them that they were planning a cruise in Hawaii in the spring of 2001. Alright, so on the morning of December 16th, 2000, the day of Mike's disappearance, Mike wakes up early before dawn on that Saturday morning to go duck hunting on Lake Seminole, which was approximately about an hour from where they lived. Mike didn't like to go hunting alone, but sometimes he would, depending on people's schedules. So this morning, it was presumed that Mike's best friend, who normally went hunting with him, would go hunting with him. However, he had plans to also go hunting with his father that morning. So the plan was for Mike to go hunting and then come back home, and then him and Denise were going to go to Apalachicola, Florida later that day for a weekend getaway for their anniversary. Around noon, Denise begins getting concerned and starts to wonder where Mike is. Denise calls her father, telling him that Mike hasn't returned home yet. Brian Winchester and his father also went down to the lake after getting the call to look for Mike, where they found Mike's 1994 Bronco and boat trailer, but no signs of Mike or Mike's boat. So since Mike was a missing hunter, the missing person report went to the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, or the FFWCC, who also initiated the search for Mike along with friends and family. Police weren't initially called since, as we mentioned, he was a missing hunter. So when the agency was initially assigned to search for Mike, all they had to go on was that there was an empty boat and Mike never showed up. The sheriff's department was on scene, but only played a supporting role for the conservation agency. They noted that while they were on scene, there wasn't any signs of foul play at that time. So around 6 p.m. on December 16th, the search was already underway, and helicopters were also brought in to help in the search for Mike, considering the size of the lake and surrounding area. Focusing on 10 acres surrounding the cove where Mike's truck was parked, his boat was located approximately 225 feet from the ramp from the helicopter pilot, who at first thought that Mike's boat was a boat of one of the volunteers helping to search for Mike. Once the boat was retrieved, investigators would find that the shotgun was still in the case and there was no signs of Mike. The area that Mike's boat was found had stumps surrounding the area, both protruding the water and also below the water, giving the area the nickname Stump Field. Investigators believe that Mike hit a stump and fell into the 8 to 12 feet deep water and sunk when his waders filled with water, causing him to drown. The Williams family was told that if Mike had drowned, his body would eventually surface, with giving them the time frame of 3 to 7 days, or it could even be longer because of the recent cold front that had come in. However, 10 days into the search, a camouflage hat was recovered, but it wasn't enough to be able to connect it to Mike. In early February, the search was called off. It was said that the search could have continued longer, but Mike's wife Denise didn't show a lot of interest in continuing the search. Now, some say that is suspicious and shows signs of guilt, but guilt of what? There's no signs of foul play and there's no body, so it could have been that she had just lost hope. Of course, it obviously wasn't just another hunting accident, or it wouldn't be on a true crime podcast. It would be on a Campfire hunting accident podcast. So some theories would come out that if Mike had drowned after accidentally falling out of his boat, then his body would have been the only one of 80 known deaths in the lake that the body was never found. This coming from the head of a private search firm that supplemented official efforts near the end of the search and offered a possible explanation. Quote, "With the wildlife around, I would guess that the alligators have dismembered and have stored the remains in a location that we would not be able to find. Early searchers had reported seeing many of them being alligators, and some of the officials were willing to accept the possibility. Quote, everyone knows the lake is full of alligators," said FFWCC's David Arnett. He also went on to say, "You look for other answers, but why hasn't the body appeared?" So being a Florida transplant, I've learned that alligators don't typically eat or feed in the winter months. They're more concerned with maintaining their body temperatures from what I've learned. Even if the ambient temperature is in the 50s to 60s during the daytime, the water would be 10 to 20 degrees cooler, if not more. Also, at night, temps would drop to 19 degrees, as it was reported during the time of Mike's disappearance. Another theory was still that Mike had fallen into the water but had become tangled in the hydrilla. That eventually found by alligators, sea turtles, and catfish, amongst other wildlife in the lake. These were all theories, however, there wasn't any definitive proof of this happening. Also, it wasn't long before the alligators or any other kind of theory was quickly debunked, because even if the alligators decided to eat Mike's remains, there would still be some sort of evidence of remains left of him. Denise Williams had been avoiding the media during the entire search of her husband, already accepting the fact that he had died. The day after the search had ended, she had arranged a memorial service to be held, which got some opposition from Cheryl, Mike's mother. In June of 2001, a fisherman fishing in the stump field came across a pair of waders floating in the lake. Divers were called into the search area and on the lake bed had discovered a lightweight camouflage jacket and a hunting license that had Jerry Michael Williams and his signature on it discovered in one of the jacket pockets. Along with the jacket was a flashlight that was also retrieved by the divers. So the problem I have with this is that according to reports, the flashlight was still working when it was found. And also his hunting license could be clearly read along with the signature. So if those items had been sitting in a swampy, murky-like area of the lake for 6 or 7 months, you wouldn't be able to clearly read the signature or the name on the license, and the flashlight certainly would not be working. Because it wasn't one of those waterproof flashlights. It was a regular household flashlight that you would keep in your junk drawer. Also, there were no teeth marks that were found nor any kind of damage on the waders. None of the items recovered showed signs of being in the water for any length of time that Mike had been missing, as well as there wasn't any DNA evidence providing that the clothing belonged to Mike. However, despite this, a Leon County judge granted Denise's petition to have Mike declared legally dead on the basis of the items that were found and the presumption that alligators and other water life consumed Mike's body entirely. A week after Denise petitioned to have Mike declared dead, she would file a claim with the life insurance company to have Mike's life insurance paid out. His life insurance was $1.75 million. So, Mike's life insurance policies were all done through Mike's best friend, Brian Winchester, who was an insurance agent. And according to reports, one of Mike's life insurance policies was going to lapse because he wasn't going to renew it. After Mike's disappearance and being declared legally dead, Brian and Denise would have a discreet type of relationship, and then 5 years later, Denise would marry Brian Winchester. So just to recap so far, between a few months and a year possibly of Mike's disappearance, his best friend Brian Winchester gives Mike a $1.75 million life insurance policy, of which Denise then claims and cashes out on several months after Mike's disappearance when she petitions to have him declared legally dead. Then, within 5 years, Brian and Denise get married. So that doesn't look suspicious at all. And of course, it's not coincidence. That never happens in these types of cases where the wife and the best friend secretly plan the death of a husband so that she can get the life insurance money and then give the best friend a cut of it, and then they marry each other afterwards. So after getting married, Brian and Denise live in the same house that she had with Mike, and Brian is raising Mike's daughter as his stepchild. For several years, Cheryl Williams spent time trying to get investigators to investigate Mike's disappearance as foul play. She always suspected something happened to Mike, that he just didn't get eaten by alligators. Also, for the longest time, she didn't believe that Mike was dead, that he was still alive as well. So finally, she gets the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, or the FDLE, and the governor at the time to continue investigating Mike's disappearance to find out what happened. In 2004, they had agreed to reopen his case. After they reopened the case and started looking at the notes that Cheryl had, as well as their own investigation, they would find that there was a lot of things that weren't adding up. For instance, the boat was found with almost a full tank of gas, and had Mike falling into the lake, the boat would have continued on running and eventually ran out of gas. So whenever searchers arrived at the lake, they would have found Mike's boat either running around in a lake, most likely in a circle, or they would have found it sitting like they found it, but instead with a full tank of gas, would have had an empty tank of gas. Also, the boat launch where Mike's Bronco and boat trailer were found at a muddy, unfinished boat ramp, and just a short distance away were two concrete pad boat ramps that Mike would typically use. Also, it was known that Mike never went hunting alone and would typically go with someone. So the fact that he was hunting alone that day was also odd to investigators as well as Cheryl. I want to thank the show's sponsor, BetterHelp, for helping keep the flame lit of the campfire for this episode. BetterHelp is the world's largest therapy service that's 100% online. So you don't have that awkwardness of sitting in a waiting room with a whole bunch of other strangers waiting to see your therapist. With BetterHelp, you have access to a network of over 25,000 licensed and experienced therapists who can help you with whatever you're dealing with. All you have to do to get started is answer some questions about what your needs and preferences are in therapy. So that way, BetterHelp can match you with a therapist that is right for you. And if you want to change your therapist because maybe you're not comfortable with them, you can change your therapist at any time for no additional charge. You also don't have to wait any specific time or any number of sessions to change your therapist. So when you match up with that right therapist, you can talk to your therapist however is most comfortable for you, whether it's text, chat, phone, or video. You can also message your therapist at any time and schedule live sessions when it's convenient for you and your schedule. With BetterHelp, you get the same professionalism and quality you expect from in-office therapy, but with a therapist who is custom-picked for you, with more scheduling flexibility and more affordable prices. So if you go to the website and use the show's code, betterhelp.com/CCC, not only does that let them know that you heard it at the campfire, but you'll also receive 10% off your first month. So that's betterhelp.com/CCC. BetterHelp, HELP.com/CCC. So at this point, the theory amongst the investigators in 2006, at the point that Mike didn't die in the lake. The new investigation had a lot of uphill struggles, however, such as the original investigation didn't treat it like a homicide or suspicious and didn't protect the crime scene like they should have. This was coming from the Williams family member who had law enforcement experience. The original investigators didn't ask any questions like they should have as well at the time of the original search when the family and friends were there. Also, the Bronco and the boat trailer were returned to the family. In addition to all of that, the scene was trampled with footprints by the volunteers, making it impossible to get any footprints or even tire marks from the scene. So the investigation would hit a brick wall. However, despite all these setbacks, the Jackson County Sheriff's Department was trying to make up for the fact that they didn't consider other options in 2000. The Sheriff's Department kept the case open with having persons of interest at the time, but wouldn't disclose it to the public. However, their persons of interest would be both Brian Winchester and Denise Williams. They had their suspicions of them, but at the time, they couldn't prove anything. So, a few things happened in 2007. FDLE closed their case about the alligator theory, thinking that was wrong because it was. And also, in October of 2007, Mike's older brother would find a picture of a serial number of a .22 caliber Ruger pistol that had once belonged to their father. Mike inherited the handgun after his father's death. After Mike was declared legally dead, the .22 was the only firearm of his not returned to the family by Denise. The Jackson County Sheriff's Department requested the aid of the ATF to look for the firearm. That would be when the ATF agents made a visit to Denise's house with Brian Winchester, where the ATF would interview them. Several days later, the gun would be delivered to the FDLE by Brian's and Denise's lawyer. Once investigators received the firearm, it was sent to the state for forensics and DNA testing. On the anniversary of Mike's disappearance in 2007, the Winchesters, both Brian and Denise, made a public statement, one of the very few that they had made since Mike's disappearance, stating, quote, "For 7 years, we have prayed and hoped to find out with certainty what happened to Mike," Brian said in an email to the Democrat, "and nobody wants Mike found more than we do," end quote. In 2008, the Florida Department of Financial Services Division of Insurance Fraud had begun investigating the disappearance from their angle, working alongside with the FDLE. Now, normally with Florida laws, the statute of limitations on crime is 5 years, which would have had expired in 2005. However, under certain circumstances, it can be extended an extra 3 years. The FWC investigators would also make a statement that had they known the size of the life insurance payout as well as the beneficiary, that they would have handled the case differently. So I believe once they had found Mike's boat and found that the shotgun was still in its case, that the boat was clean and that there was no water and no mud in it, and also the fact that they found 2 life jackets in the boat, that they should have suspected something other than a missing hunter. That right there should have been the sign that maybe they should start looking at other angles other than a missing hunter and start looking into the possibility of foul play. Because common sense tells you that if Mike had launched from a muddy boat launch, that there would be mud of sorts as well as water in the boat. By the 8th anniversary of Mike's disappearance, DIF had closed the case, quoting, "Our job was extremely difficult and we were simply unable to develop enough evidence to proceed with an investigation," end quote. They added in their statement that if they received new information that the investigation could be reopened. They had their suspicions, however, they needed more evidence to prove anything. So another lead that comes up in 2008 is from Carrie Cox, a self-described psychic and a certified forensic psychological profiler from Kentucky. Reviewing the case, she had identified a possible location of Mike's body. She gave the investigators the coordinates of the location in Wakulla County near another boat launch. However, once investigators got out there to look for the body, there was no body found. In 2012, Brian and Denise would become separated. Investigators were hoping that this would lead to one of them confessing or turning on the other of what happened to Mike. According to reports, the reason for the separation was because of Brian's sex addiction. In 2015, Denise files for divorce, and Brian was initially opposed to it and was forced to comply with the divorce. So on the morning of August 5th, Denise is leaving her home to drive to work at Florida State University. She's talking to her sister on the phone and notices something moving in the back seat, which it turns out to be Brian. Brian takes her phone away and begins yelling at directions, which Denise at first ignores until Brian pulls out a gun. So while she's looking at Brian and ignoring his directions on where he wants her to drive, she notices a tarp in the car as well and has that immediate thought that Brian was going to take her somewhere to kill her. So ignoring Brian's demands on where he wanted her to drive, she pulls into a CVS and parks up next to the door. Brian told her that he was planning to kill himself with the gun. Brian didn't want the divorce to go through and felt like he had nothing to live for if Denise went through with it. I think personally it was more the thought that he's going to lose that $1.75 million life insurance policy, amongst other things, which we're going to find out here shortly. He assures Denise that he didn't want to kill her. She talks Brian into letting her go, and she brings him back to where his truck is at a nearby park. Before exiting Denise's car, he takes a few items with him. So when the two are getting ready to leave, Brian tells Denise and asks her not to go to the police. And to satisfy Brian, she tells him that she won't go to the police and won't tell anybody anything. However, as soon as Brian leaves, that is the first place she goes to report that he had kidnapped her and was in fear for her life and had high intentions of killing her. So Brian is arrested and charged with kidnapping, aggravated assault, and armed burglary. Denise requested protection orders stating that she was in fear for her life and her daughter's life. So in December of 2017, Denise speaks at Brian's sentencing hearing, requesting that he get life in prison, telling the judge that she feared if he ever got out of prison, he would kill her. She was hoping that she could hide what happened to Mike in prison with Brian being there for the rest of his life. Brian Winchester, however, was sentenced to 20 years in prison for kidnapping with credit for 502 days of time served, which upon his release would follow with 15 years of probation. So Brian Winchester would be serving his sentence in the Wakulla Correctional Institution. With Denise turning on Brian, investigators had hoped that this would be the turning point that they needed and that Brian would help them by turning on Denise. So investigators would offer Brian a deal, unknowing, obviously, by Denise. Investigators offer Brian a one-time deal of immunity of Mike's suspicious disappearance. I want to thank the show's sponsor, BetterHelp, for helping keep the flame lit of the campfire for this episode. BetterHelp is the world's largest therapy service that's 100% online. So you don't have that awkwardness of sitting in a waiting room with a whole bunch of other strangers waiting to see your therapist. With BetterHelp, you have access to a network of over 25,000 licensed and experienced therapists who can help you with whatever you're dealing with. All you have to do to get started is answer some questions about what your needs and preferences are in therapy. So that way, BetterHelp can match you with a therapist that is right for you. And if you want to change your therapist because maybe you're not comfortable with them, you can change your therapist at any time for no additional charge. You also don't have to wait any specific time or any number of sessions to change your therapist. So when you match up with that right therapist, you can talk to your therapist however is most comfortable for you, whether it's text, chat, phone, or video. You can also message your therapist at any time and schedule live sessions when it's convenient for you and your schedule. With BetterHelp, you get the same professionalism and quality you expect from in-office therapy, but with a therapist who is custom-picked for you, with more scheduling flexibility and more affordable prices. So if you go to the website and use the show's code, betterhelp.com/CCC, not only does that let them know that you heard it at the Campfire, but you'll also receive 10% off your first month. So that's betterhelp.com/CCC. BetterHelp, HELP.com/CCC. The following day after Brian's sentencing hearing, Mike Perez, who's the FDLE's special agent in charge of the investigation, announced to reporters that Mike's body had been found and it had been determined that he was the victim of homicide. He would decline at that time to release any of the details of how he had been killed and also who might be a suspect or person of interest. He also wouldn't reveal where the body was found, saying that this was information that only the killer would know. Keeping that information close to the chest was good on their part as to not have any false confessions come from people looking to get famous or become well known in the public's eye, as we've seen all too often. We just talked about that on the last episode of the Campfire of Carol Hutto. So eventually the FDLE would reveal that they found Mike's remains at the end of a dead-end street on Gardner Road in northern Leon County, which was 5 miles from where he grew up. The remains were confirmed to be his from DNA that was matched to Cheryl's Williams. On May 8, 2018, Denise Williams is arrested at Florida State University as she was leaving work to go celebrate her daughter's 19th birthday. This came out only minutes after a grand jury had indicted her on charges of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, and accessory after the fact. Prosecutors continued to keep details of the crime to themselves, saying they would share them in court when the time came. They would state, however, that they were seeking to have bail denied. The 3-page indictment that was released revealed that the prosecutors believed Denise allegedly began conspiring with Brian in March of 2000, 9 months before her husband disappeared, to have him murdered. Winchester is allegedly to have killed Mike with a shotgun. The accessory charge suggests that sometime between August of 2014 and the day Winchester was sentenced, Denise had allegedly helped Winchester avoid prosecution or arrest for the crime. Denise's lawyer, Ethan Way, made a statement that his client was innocent of all charges, quoting, "She had absolutely nothing to do with Mike Williams' disappearance and had absolutely nothing to do with any of the crimes that Brian Winchester committed." He would go on to say that he found it convenient that the indictment came after Brian had only been imprisoned for several months, which to me says that he's trying to imply that Brian was trying to get a reduced sentence or a better deal after the fact if he gave up Denise. So June of 2018, Denise is held without bond and her trial date is set for September 24th. Audio of Brian Winchester's interview with the FDLE was played in court. And in that interview, Brian confesses to pulling the trigger. However, he would claim that the killing of Mike was Denise's idea. Her defense would argue that the tape should not have been admitted as evidence since Winchester was not charged with anything despite his admission. The prosecution said it simply asked him to tell the truth about what happened. Denise would go on trial that December. But now, if we remember the deal that was offered to Brian, he wasn't going to be charged with anything because he had immunity, so anything he said wasn't going to be able to be used against him. So at the trial, the state's star witness, Brian Winchester, would testify in length about how him and Denise had an affair starting in 1997 and went on for several years prior to Mike's murder. Kathy Thomas, who was Brian's first wife, would tell the jury that she had suspected the two having an affair in the late 90s when they frequently double dated. So when the two would discreetly rekindle their relationship, they began considering the idea of killing Mike so that they could marry each other because Denise's family frowned on divorce for religious reasons. However, also in other reports, Denise did not want to share custody of their daughter with Mike. So both the idea of being a divorcee and also sharing custody with Mike of their daughter was motive for them to kill Mike. Denise had suggested to Brian staging a boating accident on the Gulf of Mexico where they could throw both Mike and Kathy Thomas overboard. But Brian didn't want to kill Kathy. So the idea for a murder at Mike's office and to make it look like a robbery came up, but was quickly shut down because then that would cause investigation, and they didn't want that. So then Brian would hit on the idea of a hunting accident where he would throw Mike off the boat, and the idea was that he would drown. So in one of Brian's confession tapes, he tells investigators that he had to convince Mike to bring his waders so that he could get Mike to put the waders on, and then when he threw him in the water, the waders would fill with water and he would drown. So when Brian and Mike got to Lake Seminole, then once they were out on the water, he had to convince Mike to put on the waders, which he successfully did, and then threw Mike into the water. However, Mike didn't drown like Brian was hoping he would. He was able to get himself above the water to where he was able to grab onto one of the stumps. So at that point, Brian grabbed his shotgun and would shoot Mike in the face with the shotgun. Obviously not looking like an accident anymore, Brian had to take Mike's body and hide it somewhere. So after getting rid of the body, Mike cleaned out his truck and left to go to a family Christmas party, where he learned that a search was underway. He and Denise took it slow after the accident, using air quotes around accidents, both to let the insurance money earn interest and also to avoid suspicion to be brought up against them. However, that didn't work because people were still suspicious of them. They just didn't have any evidence at the time. During Denise's trial, the prosecutors would play a taped phone conversation that they had with Kathy Thomas, who was working with the police at the time and had told Denise she knew the truth about the crime. Each time that she brought it up, Denise attempted to change the subject. However, at one point asked Kathy, "What do you know?" The Assistant State Attorney John Fuchs stated that the evasiveness as well as Denise's dispassionate response whenever Brian told her how he had killed Mike demonstrated how cold-bloodedly she had helped plan the crime that had happened on her behalf. In February of 2019, Denise was sentenced to life in prison. She was 49 at the time of her sentencing. She did not speak or offer any argument on her behalf. The only other person to address the court besides the lawyers was Cheryl Williams, who said that justice had finally been served and that Denise not only took her son but also took her granddaughter from her, which we will get to here in a couple of minutes. 5 months after Denise's sentencing, Ansley, Mike's and Denise's daughter, was awarded all of the assets of her late father's estate and insurance monies due to Denise signing over all of the assets and insurance money to avoid prosecution on 3 counts of insurance fraud. As part of the deal, Ansley may not use any of the money to help in her mother's legal fees. If she had, she would receive a fine and owe the state $150,000 in penalties. Denise is now imprisoned at the Florida Women's Reception Center. In January of 2020, Denise appealed her conviction and life sentence. Her attorney would argue before the Florida First District Court of Appeals the same argument as during the trial, that there was no evidence that Denise had any involvement in the commission of Mike's murder. So then in November of 2020, the murder conviction would be overturned. However, the conspiracy to commit murder conviction was upheld, along with the 30-year prison sentence that went along with it. So since Denise's conviction, Ansley maintained a low profile and kept her social media profile private to stay out of the spotlight of the media, which you can't blame her, constantly being bombarded by media for interviews, etc. So Denise had threatened Cheryl and Mike's brother Nick of cutting Ansley out of their lives completely in the mid-2000s if they didn't stop searching for Mike. And it was reported that Denise still kept Ansley away from the Williams family. So that's what Cheryl meant in court or at the sentencing hearing about Denise taking her son and granddaughter away from her. Cheryl would make in a statement that she had hopes of being able to reconcile with Ansley. So that concludes this case at the Campfire. I know there is more information that I didn't include in this story, as there was a lot of information to cover. All resources used to gather the information for the case include, but not limited to, news articles, reports, documentaries, as well as other sources. I appreciate everyone who has gathered with me by the campfire for this case. Also, if you'd like to listen to ad-free shows as well as bonus episodes and also get a shout out on the podcast during the most recent episodes, then sign up and join me over at the Bonfire. You can find the Bonfire over on Patreon, where there are also different tiers that you can choose from. As we progress with growth, more tiers will be added. I appreciate all the support from all the listeners and supporters. Also, if you wish to support the show and not necessarily sign up for a subscription, you can support the show with the S'mores Fund through the website campfirecrimechronicles.com. A link will be provided in the show notes. Also, don't forget to check out the merchandise store that you can get the link through the website. I will also provide a link in the show notes to the merchandise store. So join me next time in 2 weeks as we gather around the campfire for the next case that we dive into. And remember to sleep with one eye open. This is the Campfire Crime Chronicles, a true crime podcast.